The Dyatlov Pass, Mystery, Russia's Frozen Horror That Was Never Solved. Section 1. The Last Journey Begins. On the first days of 1959, in the depths of a Russian winter, 9 young hikers set out toward the Ural Mountains. They were strong, experienced, and filled with an almost naive confidence. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, was just 23, a brilliant engineering student from the Ural Polytechnical Institute. His friends trusted him with their lives, and he trusted the mountain to yield to skill, endurance, and determination. They were students, athletes, dreamers, and comrades. To them, this was not simply a hike. It was a test of courage, a way to prove themselves against one of the harshest landscapes in the Soviet Union. Their destination was Otorten, a peak whose name, in the local Mansi language, meant "do not go there." It was said with the weight of old warnings, whispered through generations. But to the 9 hikers, those words were a challenge, not a curse. They laughed in the cold, wrapped themselves in wool and leather, and carried rations, journals, and a camera to record their triumph. The snow was heavy, the wind biting, but they pushed forward with songs on their lips, their footprints weaving a fragile path across the wilderness. For several days, their journey was filled with the simple rhythm of walking, resting, and writing in diaries. The journals they left behind painted a picture of optimism. One of them wrote about singing folk songs as they huddled around a small fire. Another joked about the weight of their packs, calling them monsters strapped to their backs. Yet between the cheerful notes were strange little shadows, hints of unease. They complained of the bitter cold, of a sense that the mountain was watching them, of strange sounds echoing at night beyond the reach of their firelight. By the end of January, the weather had grown darker, crueler. Snow fell in relentless sheets, blinding and suffocating. Visibility shrank until the hikers could barely see one another. They missed their intended route and strayed west, climbing toward the looming mass of Kolatsiakal, the mountain of the dead. Local legends whispered that, long ago, 9 Mansi hunters had vanished there, swallowed by snow and silence. It was a place the reindeer herders avoided, a place cursed by memory and blood. Yet here the hikers now stood, unpacking their gear, deciding to set camp on the open slope instead of retreating to the forest below. It was a decision that still chills investigators, to build a tent in the middle of a barren, windswept incline where the wind howled like an animal and the snow cut into their skin like shards of glass. Perhaps they wanted to prove their strength. Perhaps Igor wanted his team to learn in the hardest way possible. Or perhaps, deep down, they thought nothing could touch them. They pitched their tent against the storm and huddled together, writing in their diaries by the dim glow of a lantern. What they did not know, what they could not know, was that this would be the last entry, the final flicker of their voices. In the days that followed, the world would lose them, and what rescuers would eventually find would ignite one of the most chilling mysteries of the 20th century. Imagine the scene, a frozen slope under a moonless sky, 9 young souls wrapped in sleeping bags, listening to the shriek of the wind. The storm outside was relentless, the snow battering the thin canvas walls. Within the tent, the lantern light danced across their tired faces. Some tried to laugh it off, some tried to sleep, but all of them must have felt it. The unease, the weight of something pressing in on them, something waiting outside. The mountain had grown too quiet between gusts of wind, as if holding its breath. The temperature dropped lower and lower, reaching deadly levels that could freeze bare skin in seconds. In those final hours of normalcy, their journals remained strangely mundane. They wrote of bread, of boots drying, of playful arguments about who would take the first watch of the morning hike. Yet every word reads differently now, knowing what would come. They joked about the cold, but their words carry the echo of doom, like laughter before a scream. Rescuers later found the tent partially buried in snow, its sides slashed open from the inside. That single detail, the cuts made from within, tells us something happened that night, something so sudden and so terrifying that 9 experienced hikers clawed their way out rather than unfasten the entrance. Whatever they heard, whatever they saw, they believed it was death itself pressing against the canvas. But on that last night, before panic gripped them, they were just young people braving the wilderness. They sang, they dreamed, They thought about the future. They believed they had time. They did not know that only hours remained before something, whether human, natural, or supernatural, would drive them from their tent into the screaming cold, half-dressed and barefoot, never to return. And so Section 1 ends here, on the cusp of terror, in a tent on the Mountain of the Dead, where 9 hikers closed their eyes against the storm, unaware they would never open them again. Section 2. The searchers enter the Mountain of the Dead. Days passed. Letters that should have arrived never came. The hikers had promised to send word once they returned, but silence stretched on. At first, families thought little of it. After all, snowstorms often delayed expeditions. But as the days turned into weeks, worry spread like frostbite. Parents knocked on doors, demanding answers. Students whispered in the halls of the Ural Polytechnical Institute. Something was wrong. By February 20th, the silence could no longer be ignored. The families pressed authorities for action. At first, the Soviet government hesitated. Resources were tight, and winter rescue missions were costly. But when the hikers' absence became undeniable, a search party was launched. Volunteers, students, teachers, soldiers, and even local Mansi hunters joined the effort. None of them could have prepared for what they were about to find. The Ural wilderness in February was merciless. Searchers trudged through knee-deep snow, the icy wind slashing their faces raw. The mountains loomed like frozen beasts, their peaks shrouded in mist. For days, the rescuers found nothing, only endless white emptiness, the silence broken only by the crunch of boots and the whistle of the wind. Then, on February 26th, they saw it. Half buried in snow stood the hikers' tent. The canvas sagged under the weight of frost, the poles leaning awkwardly, as if the structure itself had recoiled from some unseen force. At first glance, the searchers thought the hikers might still be inside. Heartbeats quickened, but when they brushed away the snow, a dreadful stillness awaited them. The tent was empty. No bodies, no living souls, just chaos. The fabric had been cut open from the inside, long slashes tearing across the canvas as though desperate hands had clawed their way out. Inside lay scattered belongings, boots, coats, food supplies neatly stacked as if abandoned in a hurry. The most chilling detail was that their shoes and outer clothing remained behind. In temperatures dropping below 30 degrees Celsius, leaving without such protection was unthinkable. It was not a choice, it was terror. The searchers looked at one another, their faces pale. Why would they leave like this? Someone whispered. No one answered. They fanned out, following faint depressions in the snow. Bare footprints, human feet, unprotected, bleeding against the ice. 9 pairs leading down the slope into the forest. The rescuers followed with dread coiling in their stomachs. Something had driven the hikers from their shelter into the night, half-naked, barefoot, fleeing into the darkness. About a kilometer from the tent, near the edge of the woods, they found the first horror. Beneath a towering cedar tree, its branches broken as if someone had climbed in desperation, lay the remains of a small fire. Around it were 2 bodies. Their hands were raw, stripped of flesh, as though they had clawed at the bark in a hopeless attempt to climb higher. They were almost naked, clad only in underwear, their skin darkened by the cold. Their mouths were frozen open in silent screams. The rescuers stood frozen themselves, staring at the grotesque tableau. Why had they stripped to almost nothing in such deadly weather? Why had they fought to climb? Deeper into the forest, they found 3 more bodies. Dyatlov himself, along with 2 companions, lay in the snow as if trying to crawl back to the tent. Their position suggested they had staggered, fallen, tried to rise again, and failed. They too were poorly dressed, jackets missing, shoes gone. Their faces were twisted with agony, their skin already turning the waxy gray of death. 5 found, 4 missing. The search continued. Weeks later, in early May, the final 4 bodies were discovered. They were buried beneath 4 meters of snow in a ravine deeper into the forest. These were not the simple deaths of exposure seen before. These bodies told a darker story. One woman's tongue was missing, her eyes gone, as if ripped out by something unseen. Another had a fractured skull, the bone shattered with a force equal to a car crash. 2 others had broken ribs and internal injuries with no external wounds. Injuries that seemed impossible to explain. The rescuers could barely process what they were seeing. Some whispered of avalanches, others of secret Soviet weapons, others still of curses whispered by the Mansi people. But none of it explained the tent ripped from the inside, the barefoot flight, the missing eyes and tongue, or the silent scream etched forever into frozen faces. As the bodies were carried back to civilization, the Soviet government tightened its grip. Investigators arrived, questions were asked, and files were locked away. The official conclusion was, an unknown, compelling force. Cold words for something that had broken 9 young lives in ways too strange to understand. But those who touched the frozen scene knew better. This was not just death by cold or accident. The hikers had faced something unspeakable, something that drove them into madness and despair. Even now, decades later, when the snow falls heavy on Dyatlov Pass, the wind carries whispers. Some say you can hear screams in the night, muffled by distance but sharp with terror. Others claim to see flickering lights moving across the slopes, the same strange lights some reported in the sky on the night the hikers died. The mountain does not forget, and it does not forgive. And so the question remains, echoing louder with each retelling. What force, human or otherwise, descended upon that lonely tent in the Ural Mountains? What made 9 young souls slash their way into the freezing dark, barefoot and broken, never to return? The rescuers left with bodies, but they also left with fear. For on the mountain of the dead, they had looked into an abyss that refused to give answers, only more questions. Section 3. Theories of Terror. What really happened in the Ural Mountains? The Soviet investigation ended with words that sounded more like a riddle than a conclusion. The hikers died due to an unknown compelling force. That phrase echoed across the frozen silence of the Ural Mountains, and in the decades that followed, it became a breeding ground for speculation, terror, and obsession. Families demanded answers, but what they received instead were whispers of possibilities that grew darker with each telling. To this day, the question remains, what drove 9 strong, experienced hikers to tear through their tent in the middle of the night and stagger barefoot into a freezing moonlit wilderness that would soon become their tomb? Some point to the possibility of an avalanche. It is the most natural explanation, the simplest. Perhaps the young hikers heard a deep rumble above them, the sound of snow shifting like an approaching beast. Panic flooded their veins, and in the scramble to escape, they slashed open their tent and fled into the night. It seems logical, until you look closer. The slope of the mountain was not steep enough to send a wall of snow crashing down. Their tent, when discovered, still stood upright, partially covered but not crushed, its poles intact. If an avalanche had occurred, it should have been obliterated, buried deep, yet it remained almost eerily untouched. The hikers' footprints, captured in the snow, did not suggest chaos, but an eerie calm, a line of measured steps leading away into the dark. And the injuries, fractured skulls, shattered ribs, bodies torn with violence, did not resemble suffocation beneath snow. They looked instead like the aftermath of something explosive, something with a force more terrible than gravity. Others believed that the real terror that night was invisible, a wind that struck with the rage of a storm god. In rare conditions, the mountains can unleash what is known as a katabatic wind, a sudden violent torrent of air that rips across the slopes like an unseen avalanche. Imagine the sound, a roar like a freight train bearing down on your tent in the darkness. In blind panic, believing a wall of snow was about to consume them, the hikers tore their way out and fled, only to find themselves disoriented, stripped of warmth, doomed to die in the blizzard. The theory explains their desperate escape, but fails to account for the crushed bones, the missing eyes, and the severed tongue. No wind, however furious, could rip flesh in such a way. It is here that the story takes a darker turn, into the realm of human secrecy. The year was 1959, the height of the Cold War, when the Soviet Union conducted experiments under shrouds of silence. Around the same time, witnesses in nearby villages reported strange lights in the sky, glowing spheres, fiery trails, silent orbs drifting across the night. Were these meteors, or were they weapons? Some whisper that the military was testing parachute mines in the wilderness, their concussive blasts capable of shattering ribs and skulls without leaving marks on the skin. If the hikers had stumbled into a testing zone, they may have been caught in something they were never meant to see. The glowing lights above, the violent injuries, the mutilations. Suddenly, they fit together like pieces of a terrible puzzle. But this explanation, too, holds shadows, because if the military was involved, then the truth has long since been buried deeper than the snow itself. There are others who claim the 9 hikers were not who they seemed, that hidden among them were men working for the KGB engaged in a mission cloaked in deception. The expedition may have been a cover for a clandestine meeting with foreign agents, or perhaps bait for enemies who never arrived. Something went wrong, the plan collapsed, and the result was death in the snow. Was it betrayal from within, or execution from outside forces? The official documents show only ordinary students and workers, but in the Soviet Union of 1959, even ordinary lives could conceal extraordinary secrets. And then, there is the legend that predates the hikers, a story older than the Soviet Union itself. The Mansi people, who had lived in the Urals for generations, called the very mountain where the hikers camped Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead. To them it was sacred ground, a place where the spirits of the lost wandered, a place to be avoided. Some say the hikers trespassed upon land that was forbidden, violating ancient taboos. Their punishment was swift and merciless, carried out not by human hands, but by forces beyond comprehension. The missing tongue, the empty sockets where eyes once were, ritualistic signs, evidence of something older and more terrible than science could explain. The Mansi denied any involvement, but the whispers of a curse still echo in every retelling. And finally, there is the theory that takes the story out of the realm of Earth entirely. The glowing orbs in the sky were not weapons, not meteors, but something else, something otherworldly. UFO enthusiasts argue that the bodies tell a story of abduction gone wrong, of human beings caught in an experiment by forces not of this planet. The radiation found on some clothing, the mutilations that seemed almost surgical, the sudden frantic flight from the tent. These become the signs of a cosmic encounter. To some, this is madness, fantasy, the desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. To others, it is the only explanation that matches the terror found in that frozen wilderness. One by one, theories rise and fall like the snow drifts over Dyatlov Pass. Each offers a piece of the puzzle, but none completes the picture. And perhaps that is the most terrifying truth of all. That 9 young lives ended in chaos and horror, not with a clear answer, but with an absence so vast it pulls us deeper into the dark. The mountain still keeps its secret, and the world is left only with questions, each more unsettling than the last. Section 4, The Silence of the Mountain. The bodies were buried, the official reports filed, and the case closed with words that silenced more than they explained. Families mourned, but no comfort came, only the echo of unanswered questions. The hikers' journals, filled with laughter and mundane details of food and weather, end abruptly, as if life itself had been torn from the page. Their final night remains locked in silence, spoken only through the snow and the shattered remnants of their camp. Visitors who climb to Dyatlov Pass today say the place feels wrong, as if the air itself holds memory. The wind there does not sound like ordinary wind. It moans and shifts, carrying with it the ghost of voices cut short. Some climbers refuse to camp at the site, claiming that when darkness falls, the mountain seems to breathe, and a strange dread seeps into the soul. Those who dare to stay speak of waking to phantom footsteps circling their tents, the sound of fabric tearing when nothing is there, and glowing lights flickering faintly in the distance. The mountain does not forget, and perhaps it does not forgive. The photographs found in the hikers' cameras show smiling faces, the joy of adventure, of youth unbroken by fear. Yet the final frames are haunting, shadows in the snow, blurred lights in the sky, images that should not exist. One picture shows what some believe to be figures, dark shapes watching from the tree line. Was it a trick of the lens? Or did those 9 students capture, in their final moments, the very thing that doomed them? The Dyatlov Pass incident remains an open wound, a story frozen in time. Scientists argue, Skeptics dismiss, believers whisper, but the truth lies somewhere buried beneath decades of snow. The files may be closed, the case declared unsolvable, yet the mountain waits, its secret intact, its silence eternal. Perhaps the most chilling thought is not that the truth is lost, but that it is still there, just beyond our reach, waiting for the night when the wind howls once more and the mountain decides to speak. Story 2. The Tunguska event, Russia's sky explosion that shook the world. In the endless expanse of Siberia, where the forests stretch unbroken for thousands of miles and the silence of nature weighs heavier than stone, the year 1908 carried a secret that would forever stain those woods with whispers of fear. The region was wild, a place where travelers rarely passed, and where the Evenki people, reindeer herders and hunters, spoke quietly of spirits that lived among the rivers, the mountains, and the dark trees. For them, the forest was alive, something ancient and watchful. It was in this world of untamed nature that the sky tore itself open and the earth trembled as if an unseen god had placed its hand upon it. The day was June 30th, 1908. The summer sun hung high above the Siberian taiga, warming the bogs and rivers after months of bitter cold. The morning was supposed to be ordinary, but at around 7:15 a.m., hunters, herders, and scattered villages beneath the sky reported something they would never forget. Witnesses described it as a ball of fire, brighter than the sun itself, streaking across the heavens with a tail that split the sky in two. Some thought it was the wrath of Agdi, the thunder god of the Evenki. Others fell to their knees, convinced it was the end of days, the final fire sent to devour the earth. The fireball roared like the beating of 1,000 drums. Then, without warning, the air itself exploded. A blast, so fierce and so sudden, ripped across the forest with a force estimated to be greater than the bombs that would later scar Hiroshima. The shockwave leveled nearly 80 million trees in a fan-shaped pattern. Their trunks snapped like brittle twigs, their branches stripped clean, pointing away from a single mysterious epicenter. Animals were vaporized. Birds dropped from the air. The ground heaved as though something monstrous had struck it. For nearly 500 miles around, people felt the concussion. Windows shattered. Horses bolted in terror. In faraway villages, the blast knocked men from their chairs, and fires erupted in huts as sparks from the sky ignited rooftops. Eyewitnesses told of a blinding heat, of a wind so powerful it seemed to peel the very breath from their lungs. And then, silence. A silence thicker than death, broken only by the low groan of trees collapsing in waves. Those closest to the event never lived to tell what they saw. Only those on the outskirts, far enough away to escape instant annihilation, carried the memory forward. A man named Semyon Semenov recalled how he was sitting on his porch when suddenly the sky split open in fire. He described the heat as unbearable, as though his shirt had been set aflame. He was thrown several feet into the air, and for minutes afterward he could not hear anything but a ringing roar in his ears. Another witness swore that the heavens had torn apart, and from it a burning wheel had descended to punish mankind. When the smoke cleared, nothing was the same. In the heart of the forest, an area of nearly 800 square miles had been flattened. Yet strangely, there was no crater, no impact site, no sign of a meteor or stone or anything that could explain the devastation. Only trees knocked down in a perfect radial pattern, pointing outward like the spokes of a wheel, and at the center, a patch of scorched ground where the forest floor itself seemed burned away. The Evenki avoided the area, declaring it cursed. They spoke of the fire god who had descended from the sky, and warned that anyone who dared to walk upon that ground would not return. But the horror did not end with the blast itself. In the days that followed, strange things began to occur. For hundreds of miles, people reported nights so bright they could read newspapers by their windows without lamps. The sky glowed with strange luminescence, shimmering in colors of silver and crimson. Some claimed the air smelled of sulfur, others of burning stone. In London, half a world away, strange atmospheric effects were recorded. Glowing skies, twilight lingering deep into the night, as though the sun refused to leave. Scientists puzzled over it. Locals whispered of omens. But in the heart of Siberia, those who lived closest to the devastation spoke more darkly. They claimed to hear screams carried on the wind, as though the forest itself had not died quietly, but continued to cry out in agony. The event should have drawn the world's attention instantly, but Siberia in 1908 was a wilderness, remote and largely forgotten by modern civilization. News traveled slowly, and the Russian Empire, burdened with revolution and political turmoil, paid little heed to a catastrophe that had occurred in what was thought to be empty land. It was not until nearly 20 years later that a proper expedition ventured to the site. By then, nature had begun its slow reclamation, but the scars remained. When Russian scientist Leonid Kulik finally led an expedition to the Tunguska region in 1927, he expected to find a massive crater, proof of a meteorite that had struck with unimaginable force. Yet, as his team hacked their way through bogs and swarms of insects, what they discovered only deepened the mystery. The trees, millions of them, still lay flat like matchsticks, pointing outward in eerie precision. At the epicenter, however, trees stood strangely upright, their branches stripped bare, charred as if by a blast from above. Kulik described the area as a forest frozen in its death throes, a tableau of destruction unlike anything he had ever seen. But there was no crater, no meteorite fragments, no evidence of any impact from space. The local Evenki guides refused to camp at the site. They spoke in hushed tones of the curse. One guide, when pressed, told Kulik that his grandfather had seen fire raining from the sky that morning in 1908, and had heard what he described as the sky splitting apart with voices that were not human. The guides insisted that the blast was not natural, it was a punishment. The forest spirits had been angered, and no man should remain in such a place. At night, Kulik's men claimed to hear strange sounds in the distance, thuds, like heavy footsteps, echoing through the flattened forest. Some swore they saw lights moving among the dead trees, flickering as though lanterns were being carried by unseen hands. Kulik dismissed these as tricks of the mind, nerves stretched by fatigue, but he himself admitted in his journals that the atmosphere of the place was suffocating, as if the land itself remembers. As news of the Tunguska site spread, theories blossomed, each stranger than the last. Some said it was a comet, its icy body vaporizing before touching the earth. Others whispered it was a meteor of iron that had disintegrated in the sky. But among the common folk, and in the haunted whispers of the Evenki, the theories were darker. They spoke of curses, of sky gods battling above, of fiery demons descending in wrath. Still others suggested something far more terrifying, that it was not a meteor at all, but something alive, something from the heavens that had burst into flame as it fell, leaving only silence and death in its wake. The Tunguska event was not just an explosion, it was a scar, both physical and psychological, etched into the land and the minds of all who lived near it. It was the sound of the world tearing open, a reminder that there are forces above and beyond human comprehension. And in the wilderness of Siberia, where the trees still lay like bones scattered by a titan's hand, the horror remained unsolved, unclaimed, unexplainable. Even today, more than a century later, scientists struggle to piece together the truth. Was it a comet, a meteor, or something far stranger? For the Evenki, the answer had already been given. It was a visitation, and not one to be spoken of lightly. They knew, as they turned away from the scarred land, that some places are not meant for man to tread, and some fires that fall from the sky are better left unremembered. And yet, despite their warnings, researchers returned again and again, seeking answers in the desolation, unaware, or perhaps unwilling to admit, that some mysteries burned too brightly to ever be solved. 2 decades after the skies of Siberia had ripped themselves apart, the world began to remember Tunguska. Scientists, journalists, and mystics alike turned their attention toward the scarred wilderness, drawn by the mystery of an explosion that had been so powerful it could have leveled a city, yet had gone unnoticed by most of the modern world. Leonid Kulik's 1927 expedition had set the stage, but what he found only deepened the unease. Instead of clarity, there was confusion. Instead of answers, only more unsettling questions. And with each attempt to solve the mystery, It seemed as though the land itself resisted, whispering warnings to those who came too close. When Kulik first brought news of the flattened forest back to Moscow, his reports were met with skepticism. No crater, no meteorite, no proof, critics argued. To them, the Tunguska event was nothing more than a local legend exaggerated over time, but the photographs he carried, grim images of millions of trees lying prostrate as if a giant had swept them down with one hand, were impossible to ignore. The devastation was undeniable, but the cause remained out of reach. So Kulik returned in 1928, then again in 1929 and 1930, each time bringing more equipment and more men to probe the land. He scoured the bogs, dug into the soil, and measured the radiation levels of the region. What he found unsettled him further. Small patches of melted silica, as though sand had been fused into glass by extreme heat. Areas where vegetation seemed to grow differently, warped and mutated, and strange reports from his men who claimed they felt dizzy and ill whenever they camped too near the blast's epicenter. The Evenki guides refused to accompany them into certain parts of the dead forest. They said the land was angry, that the spirits had not forgiven mankind for disturbing their home. At night, Kulik's men described unsettling phenomena, phantom lights dancing in the distance, like lanterns swaying between the fallen trunks. Some swore they heard voices, faint and disembodied, whispering in languages they did not understand. Kulik dismissed this as fatigue and imagination, yet his journals betray his unease. In one entry he wrote, "There is an oppressiveness in this place that I cannot explain. It is as though the air itself holds memory." As expeditions continued into the 1930s, whispers of the Tunguska blast began to take on a new shape. Rumors spread of a second sun that had appeared in the sky that day in 1908. Some Evenki told stories of a god descending in fire, while others described a silver disk, glowing, that streaked overhead before detonating with a roar. These accounts were dismissed by scientists as folklore and distortion. Yet, as decades passed, such stories only grew louder. By the 1950s, the Soviet Union had a new interest in Tunguska, not just scientific but political. The explosion had been larger than any weapon yet devised, and though it had taken place decades before the atomic age, it seemed to foreshadow the terrifying power mankind was just beginning to harness. Researchers, some in secrecy, began to wonder, what if the Tunguska blast had not been natural at all? What if it had been something artificial, something controlled? Some whispered of weapons tests conducted by powers unknown. Others speculated about visitors from beyond the Earth. One of the strangest details that haunted investigators was the absence of a crater. No meteorite, no fragments, no iron or stone buried in the soil. If a space rock had truly struck the Earth with such fury, where was the evidence? The trees pointed outward in a perfect radial pattern, the classic signature of a massive explosion in the air rather than on the ground. Scientists called it an airburst, where a comet or meteor vaporizes before reaching the surface. But why then were there no chemical traces consistent with such objects? And why did radiation levels in certain patches of the forest measure higher than they should? Stories from locals added fuel to the fire. In the 1930s, an Evenki elder claimed that hunters who ventured too close to the epicenter often became sick afterward, their skin pale, their hair falling out. Others swore that animals avoided the area, skirting its borders as if driven by instinct. There were tales of hunters who camped near the site and never returned, their remains never found. A curse, some called it, a scar that resisted healing. The mystery only deepened when strange aerial sightings began to be reported in the decades after the event. Pilots flying over the Tunguska region claimed to see odd lights beneath them, glowing orbs that seemed to move with purpose. One Soviet pilot in the late 1940s described a column of light that rose from the forest floor like a beam, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. When his report reached Moscow, he was told never to speak of it again. By the time the Cold War was at its height, Tunguska had become a playground for both serious science and wild speculation. Some said the explosion had been caused by a comet fragment rich in ice, vaporizing before impact. Others argued for antimatter, a collision so rare and exotic it bordered on science fiction. A few went further still, suggesting that an alien craft had entered Earth's atmosphere that morning in 1908, crippled, and detonated in the sky. Was Tunguska the world's first brush with extraterrestrials? The Soviets, notoriously secretive, allowed little of this speculation to reach the public, but fragments of stories escaped. Researchers who visited the site in the 1960s described magnetic anomalies, compasses spinning wildly, and instruments failing without reason. They told of soil samples that contained elements unusual for the region, elements that could not easily be explained by natural causes. And then there were the photographs. Aerial images showing the blast zone not as a random scatter, but as a nearly perfect butterfly-shaped pattern, as though the force that caused it had direction, intention. Meanwhile, among the Evenki people, the old stories never died. Elders passed them down in whispers, of the fire god who had descended, of the thunderbird that had fought a battle in the skies, of spirits that still walked the flattened forest. To them, the scientific debates meant little. They knew only that the land was cursed, that the dead trees were bones of a slain giant, and that at night the air carried echoes of something no human should hear. In the 1970s, another wave of researchers returned, armed with new technology. What they discovered was perhaps the most unsettling of all. The growth of trees in the epicenter appeared faster, more vigorous, than in the untouched forests around it. Radiation levels again spiked, higher than they should have been for natural background levels. It was as though the land itself had been altered, infused with a hidden energy. Some whispered of genetic mutation. Others saw in it proof of something unnatural, a contamination from beyond. The more evidence gathered, the less clear the truth became. Each explanation gave birth to more questions. If it was a comet, why no trace? If a meteor, why no fragments? If a natural explosion, why the lingering radiation, the warped growth, the stories of sickness? And if none of these, what else could it have been? Somewhere beneath all the scientific debates, beneath the folklore and the secrecy, the true story of Tunguska remained buried. Perhaps it was a comet, perhaps something stranger. But the fear lingered not because of what was known, but because of what remained unknown. To this day, the Evenki refuse to linger near the site. Hunters still turn their eyes away from its borders, and researchers who travel there often speak of a feeling, an oppressive sense, like being watched. The blast of 1908 was not merely an event, it was a wound that had never fully closed. And as each decade passed, the wound whispered louder, reminding mankind that the earth is not always safe, that the sky can still betray us, and that sometimes something else is watching. The deeper the world peered into the Tunguska mystery, the further the answers seemed to retreat. By the late 20th century, the event had crossed the boundary between science and legend, standing in that uneasy twilight where both worlds coexisted. In classrooms, students were told about a comet fragment exploding in the skies over Siberia. In bars, whispers suggested that a Soviet cover-up hid something much stranger. And among the Evenki, the story of the fire god endured, retold around fires where the dark forest creaked and groaned as though remembering its wound. When the first satellites looked down on the Siberian wilderness, the scar was still there, vast, raw, undeniable. Even decades later, aerial photographs revealed the same butterfly-shaped pattern, the same massive swath of flattened trees radiating outward from a center that refused to give up its secret. The epicenter, curiously barren for so long, began to regrow. But even then, the trees grew in twisted ways, some gnarled and bent as though shaped by unseen hands. Botanists noted strange cellular structures in the vegetation, mutations subtle but unmistakable, as if nature itself had been altered on a fundamental level. In the 1980s, researchers brought more advanced instruments, armed with Geiger counters, magnetometers, and chemical analysis kits. The results painted an unsettling picture. Certain patches of soil near the epicenter showed inexplicable anomalies. Trace amounts of elements such as iridium and nickel, often associated with meteorites, appeared, but in concentrations far too low to support the impact theory. There were no fragments large enough to display, no meteorite to place in a museum case, no crater to mark the site of collision. Only whispers in the soil, hints of something that resisted categorization. And then came the strange accounts from those who visited. Members of research teams spoke of sudden nausea when stepping into the heart of the blast zone, dizziness that vanished the moment they retreated. Some claimed their equipment malfunctioned without explanation. Cameras refusing to advance film, batteries draining in minutes, compasses spinning uselessly. One expedition leader noted in his journal that during a midnight watch, a graduate student swore he saw a sphere of faint blue light drift silently between the trees before vanishing into the ground. It was dismissed as hallucination born of fatigue. But the student insisted until the end of his days that what he saw was real and not of this earth. As the Cold War raged, secrecy deepened. The Soviets, always wary of the unknown, quietly restricted foreign access to the region. Rumors spread of classified missions to Tunguska, soldiers airlifted in at night, crates carried out by helicopter and never seen again. Stories of strange metallic fragments confiscated by the state circulated among dissidents and exiles. Some believed the fragments belonged to an alien craft that had exploded mid-air. Others said it was the test of a secret weapon. Perhaps even Nikola Tesla's rumored death ray, which conspiracy theorists insisted he had tested from across the ocean, his machines reaching into Siberia to unleash devastation. The deeper one dug, the more the theories spiraled outward. Comet or asteroid, alien ship or cosmic weapon, or something far stranger, something beyond human comprehension. One theory that gained traction among Soviet researchers, though never officially admitted, was that Tunguska was not a natural phenomenon at all, but the result of an experiment gone wrong. Some believed that atmospheric weapons, attempts to manipulate weather or unleash directed energy, had been tested only to spiral catastrophically out of control. If true, it meant the mystery was not cosmic, but man-made, and the secrecy was a desperate attempt to bury a blunder too terrible to admit. But for many, the alien explanation refused to die. Locals told of lights in the sky days before the blast, of strange humming sounds, of animals fleeing in panic. Later witnesses reported odd aircraft seen circling the area in the decades after, though nothing officially logged. One story from the 1960s claimed that a helicopter crew flying low over Tunguska saw a metallic reflection glimmering beneath the swamps, like something vast buried under the mud. Their superiors allegedly ordered them to report nothing. They never spoke of it again. The fear was not only about what had happened, but what might happen again. Tunguska was a warning, some said, that the Earth was vulnerable, its skies capable of sudden betrayal. If the 1908 event had struck over London, Paris, or New York instead of Siberia, millions would have perished in seconds. Whole cities could have been erased, and yet no one knew how to predict or prevent such a catastrophe. The silence of the forest was not comforting. It was a reminder of fragility, of how little control humanity truly held. As the new millennium approached, international teams returned, free now of Soviet secrecy. They brought modern tools, computers, satellite imaging, and drone surveys. But even with all this, the mystery remained stubborn. No fragments, no crater. Only whispers in the soil, scars in the forest, and stories that refused to fade. Some scientists clung to the comet theory, pointing to microscopic spheres in the soil as proof. But others countered, the spheres could have come from industrial contamination, or even volcanic activity. Nothing was certain. Nothing was final. Then came the stories of the reindeer herders who still roamed near Tunguska. In the early 2000s, one family reported lights in the sky above the forest, silent, glowing orbs that hovered before vanishing in a flash. Others spoke of nightmares after camping near the site, dreams filled with fire, with a blinding second sun, with voices calling from the trees. A handful even claimed they heard the screams of men in the night, echoing from nowhere, only to wake and find themselves alone. The fear of Tunguska lingered, feeding modern anxieties. Documentaries called it the world's greatest unsolved explosion. Some whispered of government cover-ups, others of alien warnings, still others of dimensions brushing against our own. To the Evenki, it remained simpler. The forest had been scarred by something that should never have come, a wound where the earth itself remembered. And still, the cliffhanger of Tunguska refuses to end. In 2013, over a century after the Siberian blast, the skies over Chelyabinsk lit up with a fiery meteor that exploded in the atmosphere. Windows shattered, buildings shook, and thousands were injured. It was the closest humanity had come to reliving Tunguska in the modern age. And yet, compared to the vast devastation of 1908, Chelyabinsk was small, a reminder that what happened once could happen again, on a far deadlier scale. Tunguska waits, its mystery unresolved. The scar is fading now, trees regrown, wildlife returning. But beneath the soil, anomalies persist. Compasses still falter. Strange lights are still seen. And deep in the night, under a sky vast and indifferent, the forest seems to breathe, as though something lies beneath, watching, waiting. Perhaps one day the earth will give up its secret. Perhaps one day the truth will claw its way from the mud and the moss and into the light. But until then, Tunguska remains the ultimate cliffhanger in history's horror. An explosion with no clear cause, a fire from the sky with no clear origin. A reminder that sometimes the most terrifying thing is not what we know, but what we may never know. And somewhere in that forest, amid the twisted trees and shifting shadows, the wound whispers still. Story 3. The Lost Colony of Roanoke, 1587. The summer sun hung heavy over the coast of what would one day be called North Carolina. But in 1587, the land was wild, strange, and unsettling. For the settlers of Roanoke, the air itself seemed to breathe with secrets, the forests whispering in voices they could not name. They had crossed an ocean with promises of fertile land and freedom, yet what awaited them was isolation, hunger, and the growing sense that they were not alone. From the moment the English colonists set foot on Roanoke Island, something felt wrong, though no one dared admit it aloud. The trees loomed too close, shadows bending unnaturally, and at night the winds carried sounds like distant wails. Some dismissed them as animals. Others wondered if they were cries of the lost, trapped in this uncharted land. John White, the colony's governor, was both determined and weary. He had left behind his homeland, his friends, and his sense of safety to bring over 100 settlers, including families, to this small island in the New World. Among them was his daughter, Eleanor Dare, who had given birth to Virginia Dare, the first English child born on American soil. That birth should have been a symbol of hope, but instead it felt like a fragile candle flickering in endless darkness. For the land was not welcoming. Crops withered in the unfamiliar soil, supplies dwindled quickly, and trade with the native tribes faltered. A sense of unease settled over the colony like a fog that never lifted. It was not only scarcity that haunted them. The settlers often reported strange figures glimpsed at the tree line. Men swore they saw shapes watching them, tall, still, their eyes catching what little light the moon offered. Yet when they approached, nothing was there but the silent forest. Women spoke of voices, whispers that seemed to follow them, words too faint to understand but laced with menace. Even children refused to play at night, saying the woods called their names in the dark. White dismissed these as the growing fears of tired, starving people. But deep inside, he too felt that something in this land resisted their presence. As weeks turned to months, desperation forced White to return to England for supplies, leaving behind his daughter, his granddaughter, and over 100 souls to endure until he could return. It was a painful choice, but survival demanded it. He swore to come back quickly, yet storms, political turmoil, and war with Spain delayed him far longer than he imagined. By the time he set foot again on Roanoke soil in 1590, 3 years had passed. The air was still, unnaturally so, as if holding its breath. The settlement was silent. Houses had been dismantled, not destroyed in violence but carefully taken apart. There were no signs of struggle, no graves, no bodies. Only one thing remained. Carved into the wood of a post was a single word: Croatoan. That word has echoed through centuries, a mystery too sharp to dull with time. Historians speculate it meant the colonists moved to Croatoan Island, now known as Hatteras. But if they had, why was there no trace of them? White had agreed with the settlers before leaving that if they were forced to move, they would carve their destination into the wood. If they left under duress, they would carve a cross. There was no cross, only that single word, etched with steady hands. To White, it should have been a message of hope, but the silence of the abandoned colony made it feel like a curse. The deeper one looks into the story, the stranger it becomes. Native oral traditions tell of pale-skinned spirits appearing in their lands, speaking broken words, some begging, others hostile. Skeletal remains with European features have been claimed but never confirmed. Some settlers may have integrated with native tribes, but no full account, no diary, no survivor, no definitive proof has ever surfaced. Instead, only silence, and the word carved like a tombstone. To this day, no one knows if those 100 men, women, and children were slaughtered, starved, absorbed into other communities, or simply vanished into something more sinister that cannot be written in history books. But among the legends whispered in the South, darker tales survive, stories too chilling to make it into the official record. Locals speak of spirits roaming Roanoke Island, voices on the wind, shadows slipping among the trees. Fishermen claim to hear cries on still nights, as though 100 lost souls still search for salvation that never came. Travelers report seeing a woman in colonial garb wandering the shores clutching a child, only to dissolve into mist when approached. Even modern visitors feel the weight of dread, a silence that thickens as dusk falls, as though the island itself remembers what was lost. Some folklorists believe the land cursed the settlers, that the spirits of native tribes wronged by the English rose against them. Others whisper of something older, something that predates both settler and native, an ancient force that guarded the island, something that rejected outsiders. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony may have been the first great American ghost story, born not of imagination but of unexplainable reality. No bones, no traces, no graves, only absence, the most haunting evidence of all. For John White, the loss was unbearable. His daughter, his granddaughter, the first English child of the New World, all gone without a trace. He never saw them again, and history closed its book on their fate. Yet in the whispers of the night, in the restless trees of Roanoke Island, the lost colony lingers, refusing to rest. It is said that when the wind is right, you can still hear children laughing, mothers calling their names, and men shouting in panic, echoes from a colony that vanished into silence. The truth may never be known, but sometimes truth is not what survives. It is the fear, the whispers, and the shadows that last the longest. Roanoke remains more than a mystery. It is a wound in history, a silence that screams louder than any tale. And for those who still walk the island at night, the darkness presses close, carrying with it the memory of over 100 souls swallowed whole, their voices forever carved into the wood in one single word, Croatoan. The abandoned village stood in perfect stillness. The remnants of crude shelters, stripped and dismantled, formed skeletal outlines against the sky. John White had expected to be greeted by the laughter of children, the smoke of hearths, the relief of reunion. Instead, silence pressed against his ears so heavily that he swore he could hear his own pulse. The word Croatoan stared back at him from the weathered wood, mocking, taunting, and offering no answers. 3 years gone, and the lives of over 100 souls reduced to nothing more than a single word carved by a steady but desperate hand. White wandered among the ruins, calling out names, his voice cracking in the humid air, but no one responded. The wind rustled the grass where his granddaughter might once have toddled, and he thought he heard faint laughter carried in it. He turned sharply, heart pounding, but there was only emptiness. The men who accompanied him grew restless. Some muttered prayers, others crossed themselves as though warding off an unseen evil. To them, the land itself felt cursed, and this place, this hollow echo of a settlement, was its altar. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no broken weapons, no bodies. But that absence was more unsettling than carnage. It was as if the colony had been carefully erased, plucked from existence without struggle, leaving only the faintest trace behind. One soldier whispered that perhaps the settlers had walked willingly into the forest, compelled by voices that still whispered just beyond the tree line. Another swore he saw footprints in the dirt. too fresh to belong to people who had vanished 3 years before. They searched, but nothing remained. No bodies, no graves, no bones. Even their tools were gone, as if they had packed for a journey into the unknown. Back in England, the story of the lost colony spread like wildfire. Scholars debated, nobles speculated, sailors spun tales that grew darker with every telling. The official explanation was pragmatic. The colonists must have moved to Croatoan Island, integrating with the native tribe there. But even the most logical accounts could not erase the eerie emptiness of White's discovery. A whole colony vanished, leaving not even the comfort of certainty behind. For those who believed in omens and curses, the story became something far darker. They whispered that the settlers had angered the spirits of the land, and that Roanoke had claimed them as its own. Legends blossomed like weeds in the fertile soil of uncertainty. One story claimed the colonists had resorted to cannibalism when supplies dwindled, driven mad by hunger and isolation, until there was nothing left but silence and bones buried in shallow pits. Another tale insisted they had been taken by shadowed figures, neither native nor human, who came at night with glowing eyes and voices that lured the settlers into the forest, never to return. Sailors swore they saw lights on Roanoke's shore long after the colony vanished, strange fires that flickered and vanished as quickly as they appeared. Some even claimed to hear faint music carried on the wind, like voices chanting in sorrowful tones. Native tribes, too, carried stories. Some spoke of ghostly figures wandering the woods, pale-skinned and wailing, searching for their families. Others said the settlers had been punished by the spirits of the island for attempting to tame what was never meant to be tamed. In their stories, the settlers were transformed into shadows themselves, bound to Roanoke forever, condemned to walk in silence. Even among the Croatoan, the very word carved into the post, the tale carried unease. Some believed the settlers had indeed come to them, but only for a short while, and that something followed, something that claimed them not long after. Centuries passed, and the mystery of Roanoke refused to die. Explorers, archaeologists, and scholars returned again and again to search for answers, but the land yielded none. No bodies, no artifacts, no evidence that could fully explain the disappearance. Instead, the silence deepened, and with it, the legends grew darker. Visitors to Roanoke Island reported unsettling experiences. They spoke of being watched by unseen eyes, of feeling an oppressive weight in the air, as if history itself pressed down upon them. Campers told of hearing children crying in the night, only to find no one there. A few claimed to see a woman in colonial dress standing on the shore, holding a child, her face etched with sorrow. She would look at them with pleading eyes before dissolving into mist. The story of Virginia Dare, the first English child born in the New World, became its own haunting legend. Some said she grew into a beautiful young woman among the tribes, but was cursed to wander as a white doe, eternally hunted, never finding peace. Others believed her spirit still lingered, searching endlessly for her mother, calling in a voice too faint to be heard. For many, Virginia embodied the tragedy of Roanoke, the promise of new beginnings swallowed whole by the silence of the wilderness. Her name became a whisper of what was lost, a reminder that some mysteries are too heavy to bury. Even in modern times, Roanoke has not shaken its ghostly reputation. Archaeologists dig, historians theorize, scientists speculate, but the truth remains elusive. Instead, the island feeds on its silence, turning it into a story far stronger than any fact could be. Paranormal investigators have walked its woods with recorders, capturing faint whispers and cries that defy explanation. Some tourists swear they feel unseen hands tug at their clothes or hear footsteps trailing behind them, though no one is near. There are those who say the settlers never left, not in spirit, that Roanoke Island remains their prison, holding them in an endless loop of hunger, fear, and despair, that their voices are not lost but waiting, carried on the wind for those who dare to listen. For skeptics, the story is a puzzle, a curiosity of history. But for those who have stood on the shores of Roanoke and felt the weight of its silence, it is more than that. It is a wound that will not heal, a place where the line between the living and the dead has grown thin. Every theory, every rational explanation crumbles under the same truth. Over 100 men, women, and children vanished without a trace, leaving behind nothing but a single word: Croatoan. And perhaps the reason the mystery endures is that some part of us knows the truth is not meant to be found. For what is more terrifying than an answer is an absence so complete, it feels as though the land itself devoured the colony, swallowing them whole and erasing them from existence. And in that silence, in that emptiness, the whispers continue. Some say the settlers are still there, bound in a place between life and death, reaching out for anyone who dares to walk where they once lived. Others say the island itself hungers, and that Roanoke was only the beginning. Either way, when night falls and the wind stirs the trees, the island seems to breathe again, and somewhere in that breath, the voices rise, not forgotten, but waiting. The lost colony is not merely a mystery of history, it is a haunting, and the silence it left behind is the loudest sound of all. The storm rolled across the coast as night fell over Roanoke, lightning tearing open the sky and illuminating the empty settlement. Long after John White left, the land remained untouched, as though no one dared claim it again. Yet stories began to grow, whispered among sailors and travelers who skirted the island's shores. They said lights would flare suddenly in the distance, torches bobbing in a line across the beach, before vanishing all at once. Some claimed they could hear voices calling through the storm, children crying out in the darkness, though no one lived there anymore. Over the centuries, these tales passed from mouth to mouth, never written in the records of kings, but carried in the private superstitions of men who had seen too much. When explorers ventured near the ruins, some returned shaken, unable to describe what they had felt. They said the silence of the place was unbearable, heavier than any battlefield or graveyard. Birds avoided the site, and no animals lingered there long. A few who camped overnight woke screaming, swearing they had seen figures standing over them, half shrouded in shadow, their eyes hollow, mouths moving as though they were speaking, though no sound came out. Others swore they heard the settlers calling to them by name, even when those names belonged to men who had never set foot on the island. There are those who believe Roanoke was not a disappearance but a transformation, that the settlers had been consumed by the land, their souls fused with the trees, the soil, the sea. A colony not destroyed, but absorbed, their voices forever whispering in the roots of the forest. This theory was strengthened by a recurring detail in stories told by native tribes, pale figures moving in the woods, not entirely human, not entirely gone. Some spoke of them as warnings: do not venture too close, for those who disappeared once may seek to take more with them. The legend of Virginia Dare, too, continued to darken with each telling. No longer was she the innocent child of a lost colony, but a figure transformed into something between a curse and a spirit. The tale of the white doe haunted the countryside for generations. Hunters swore they saw her form impossibly radiant under the moonlight. Some claimed she cried like a human child when arrows pierced her side, but when they searched, there was nothing in the grass but blood that shimmered like silver. To some, she was a protector, leading wanderers out of the woods before they could vanish as her people had. To others, she was a lure, drawing the curious deeper into the forest until the silence swallowed them too. And there were those who saw patterns where others saw coincidence. In towns far removed from Roanoke, mysterious vanishings were whispered to be its echo. Families that disappeared without a trace, entire outposts found abandoned, meals left half-eaten, belongings untouched, as though the people had risen all at once and walked into the trees. The same unease lingered in each case, the sense that something unseen had moved through, quiet and deliberate, leaving only questions behind. The word Croatoan was not always there, but the implication was that Roanoke had marked the beginning of something, not the end. In later centuries, the word itself carried a strange weight. When Edgar Allan Poe lay dying in a delirium, some swore the last word he spoke was Croatoan. When the infamous stage magician Harry Houdini planned his final stunt, he scribbled the word in his diary just before his death. Even the wreckage of ships was sometimes found with the word carved into their beams, as though the sea itself had inherited the curse of Roanoke. Whether truth or invention, each story bound the mystery tighter, threading it into folklore as if the island's hunger reached far beyond its shores. Paranormal investigators who stepped onto Roanoke Island in the modern era brought equipment, recorders, cameras, meters designed to capture what the human senses could not. What they collected only deepened the unease. Static-laden recordings filled with faint cries, bursts of voices too distorted to identify but unmistakably human. Some devices captured knocks and scratches in empty cabins where no one stood. Others reported shadows crossing in front of cameras, their outlines faint, dissolving before they could be studied. One team fled the island after a night of experiments, swearing they heard children running through the brush, giggling and whispering, the sounds circling them faster and faster until one of them shouted in terror and the noise stopped all at once. Historians argue still, but the supernatural explanations refuse to fade. Perhaps it was starvation, perhaps the settlers joined with local tribes, perhaps war or disease consumed them. Yet none of these answers can explain the feeling people carry away from Roanoke. The pressing silence, the sense of eyes watching, the cold touch of wind that feels like breath. Facts crumble against the weight of the unknown, and the unknown feeds on fear. It is said that those who look too long for answers at Roanoke begin to dream of the settlers, their faces pale, their mouths open in endless screams. Some wake with dirt under their fingernails, as though they had clawed at the ground all night in their sleep. The mystery endures because it was never meant to end. And perhaps the greatest horror is not that the settlers died, but that they crossed into something else, something that waits, something that has been calling ever since. Croatoan was not a destination, but a warning, a mark, a message carved for those who would come after. We are gone, but we are not free. Imagine it now. The settlers walking hand in hand into the forest, children carried, torches flickering, their eyes glassy and unblinking, not frightened, not fighting, but compelled, drawn towards something none of them could resist. Their voices would have blended into the hum of the night, their forms swallowed by the trees, until only the settlement remained, hollow and silent, waiting for someone to discover the word carved into wood, waiting for someone to understand that it was never the end, only the beginning, and so the story remains unfinished. Each year, new theories emerge, new evidence is claimed, new voices add to the debate, yet the silence never breaks. Roanoke waits, as it has always waited, patient and unyielding. Some who visit the island claim they hear the settlers calling, not for help, but for others to join them. A colony once lost, now eternal, forever growing in the shadows of the forest. Perhaps one day the mystery will be solved, the truth uncovered. Or perhaps the truth is not meant to be known. Perhaps Roanoke is not a story of loss at all, but a story of hunger. And hunger, once awakened, never fades. So if you find yourself walking the quiet shores of Roanoke, and the wind carries whispers you cannot explain, do not listen too closely. Do not follow the laughter of unseen children or the faint glow of lights deeper into the trees. For the silence is still there, waiting, and the colony is not as lost as it seems. And if you ever see the word Croatoan carved where it does not belong, on wood, on stone, on a place that should be untouched, leave at once, because it means the same hunger that claimed Roanoke has found you. And this time, it is not a colony it seeks. It is you.